Muy buenos días. Pues bienvenidos. Creo que estamos listos, sigue entrando mucha gente. Estamos listos para comenzar el día de hoy, el segundo día del Congreso de ALTEC 2017. Bienvenidos a todos. Mi nombre es Tere de León, trabajo en el CONACYT y pues es un gusto para mí que me hayan invitado a estar con ustedes en este momento y a moderar esta conferencia magistral con la que inicia el segundo día de su Congreso. Inicia la conferencia magistral con el doctor Keld Laursen, a quien me voy a permitir presentar. Él posteriormente dará una presentación de alrededor de 50 minutos y pues posteriormente abriré la mesa a preguntas del público y entiendo que es con micrófono, ¿verdad, Gaby? Se ponen de pie, pueden mencionar quiénes son, de dónde vienen y pues podremos tener algunas preguntas para el doctor Laursen. Pues sin más, presento al doctor Keld Laursen. He is professor of the Economics and Management of Innovation at Copenhagen Business School. He received his master's degree from SPRU, this is the Science Policy and Research Unit at the University of Sussex in the United Kingdom, and got his PhD from the University of Aalborg in Denmark in 1998. Dr. Laursen is one of the co-editors of the leading journal in innovation research, Research Policy, and he serves on his chair track of the Academy of Management Technology Innovation Management Division, that has more than 3,000 members from 2013 to 2018. For 2016 to 17, he served as the division's chair, and he currently serves as the division's past chair. Dr. Laursen has organized and co-organized a number of international conferences, including several vintages of the DRUID Summer Conference, the US-rooted CCC, which is Consortium for Cooperation and Competition Annual Colloquium for Doctoral Student Research, held in Copenhagen Business School in 2009, and the European-based SEI, which means Strategy, Entrepreneurship and Innovation, Doctoral Consortium in 2012. Keld is a founding member of SEI's executive board. His primary area of expertise is in how firms manage innovation. Within this context, Dr. Laursen has focused on the organizational aspects of open innovation and the consequences for innovation performance. His research has been published in outlets such as Strategic Management Journal, Organization Science, Journal of International Business Studies, Journal of Economic Geography and Research Policy. And today, Dr. Laursen is going to talk to us about majority matters, the impact of cultural diversity on the performance of startup teams. Welcome, and thank you very much for being here. Simultánea, me indican que allá afuera, ¿verdad? Pueden pasar por diademas allá afuera.
Buenos dias. Thank you very much. Thank you for the kind introduction. It's a pleasure to be here in Mexico City. I've not been here before, but it's certainly been a nice experience so far. Sunday I walked around the city and I was really inspired by all the life and the culture around. So it at least the historical part was just totally inspired me. Now we'll see if I can inspire you during this 1 hour talk here. I'm going to talk about human resources and how they are managed and how that pertains to cultural diversity within these teams. And this work is joint work with my colleague at Copenhagen Business School, Jan van Praag, and Sander Hoggendorn. So human resources are increasingly determining organizational performance in the modern economy. Teams also play a critical role in this. We know that many multinational corporations, they apply teams when they have to solve complex problems. And teams are also a critical feature when it comes to new entrepreneurial ventures. One thing that is very important in this context is then who's actually a member of this team. So one important aspect here would be the cultural dimension to this. So in this audience, we see people from, I guess, predominantly Spanish cultures, but there's also Portuguese cultures. There's people with more or less European origins and so on. So there's a host of different backgrounds of people. And this can be an advantage. We know from Schumpeter that bringing stuff together allows for more recombination, and it also allows for more learning between humans in these teams. So there's a lot of good things to be said about working together in teams. There's lots of research on that, but there's also some research on the downsides of that. Or rather, it's not a given that teams will work well together under all conditions. So that's going to be a very important part of my story. We are going to have a focus on startup teams in particular. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some theory behind this, and then I will talk about the field experiment that we used to test some of these ideas. And that went on basically in the student setting, but where students in a university in Amsterdam had to form real teams that had to sell real products and that made or did not make real profits. So looking a little bit at what we know about this topic, in the psychology literature and in the management literature, there's been a lot of writing about these issues. This implies that our understanding of the links between various aspects of diversity, could be gender, it could be culture, as I'm going to talk about today, that has increased markedly. And there is really two mechanisms that I already alluded to. That would be that differences in perspectives between individuals that will allow for better problem solution and perhaps also creativity and innovation and all these kind of things. But at the same time, teams that consist of people with different backgrounds, including cultural ones, can find it difficult to work together. So one problem that has been illuminated in the literature that I will not talk about, that's problems related to communication. So one problem with teams working together is that people in teams do not speak the same language. We are going to kind of assume that away because we are going to work with students with a reasonably similar background before they were admitted into the particular program. But the other problem, which is then not necessarily communication, that could also be that the diversity that leads you to different understandings. You more easily interact if you, for instance, come from the same culture. And I know that very much. I come from a university that has internationalized recently, and if you think about how we treated the foreigners, as we used to call them, we can call them the non-Danes in my institution, then of course that was not always easy. So we are going to look at these forces and we're going to specify this in a particular way that I'll lay out. So we're going to try to specify this more precisely from a theoretical point of view, and then in addition to that we're going to make this subject to this test in a field experiment where we are looking at hundreds of students that have formed a total of 45 firms, if you like, that then they do not necessarily compete, but they do perform according to metrics. It's measured in euros. So how much surplus do these teams make? So here's the example from my own school. So this is a picture. I couldn't find a better picture of the first building that I worked in Copenhagen Business School. It was in 1998 that I arrived through this door here. It's called Nansensgade 19. It's at the center of Copenhagen. And I remember once that I had to go down and meet a visitor, and this visitor was not so polite, and he said, that's probably the ugliest building in Copenhagen. But actually later on we moved to this building over here since 2005 in the more nice location in Frederiksberg in Denmark. But there was also other things that changed, and that's more pertinent to my story, actually. So the story of a paper in a nutshell is really the story of my academic department. So when I arrived in the department, there was no Danes. There were only Danes employed. But then, around the same time as I arrived, we hired this guy, Volker Manke. So we had only one non-Dane on the list of faculty. So a lot of homogeneity on the team. And here you can say the story is actually, as a starting point, that when it comes to innovation and creativity, then it's a pretty linear story. If you have more different backgrounds, if you have more experiences, then we should actually expect the more diverse, the better the output. That's of course a nice and very simple story, but it's not the only part of the story. So actually in those days one should expect that our department was not that creative, given that we were just Danes in the department more or less, until Volker arrived. Actually, this is how the department looks today in terms of foreigners. So that's about half of the faculty members. I'm not going to name the people here, but we have a Chinese faculty member, a couple of Italians, Portuguese, American, Germans, Austrian. So there's a lot of nationalities in the department, and it's probably around 50-50. So the other part, the Danish-looking people, those I've not put on my slide up here. But so one part of my story is, yes, the more diverse the team is, the more opportunity for recombination and joint learning. However, at the same time, there's also in-group, out-group dynamics. So this comes from social psychology. There's this idea that a dominant group can just take the power and totally ignore the other group, which is then the out-group. So the in-group would, in our case, would be the Danes, and the out-group, that would be poor Volker over here. Okay, he was not so much out-group, but this is just for reasons of exposition. So actually, at the beginning, when diversity is very low in the situation of around 1998 in my department, then you can say that we did not have to use a lot of effort in arguing or disagreeing on stuff due to different backgrounds. So there was very little conflict. People have shared perspectives and so on. But the problem becomes when you have the in-group, out-group logic, that when you then increase in terms of diversity, so you get more and more non-Danes employed, you will get more and more conflict. You are able to communicate because we are all academics. That's also going to be our empirical setting here. But even if we're able to communicate, we disagree on stuff. So that's a problem of diversity in our conceptualization. So we will see a sort of a drop in organizational performance as you hire more of these people here to your right. However, at one point, just about when we reach 50% of the distribution, when we get 50% of non-Danes, which is approximately the situation in my department today, then it becomes actually costly to ignore these people who are members of the out-group, if you like. And if the organization is also fairly democratic and flat in hierarchical structure, then just by counting the numbers, the Danes, or as it'll be in our story here, the Dutch, cannot just say, well, hey, we're the majority. They have to start accepting at least some of the people from the out-group, as it were. So and also, of course, when we talk about teams of moderate size, then it's a bit difficult just to ignore all the efforts of about 50% of the team. Or when you increase the number of foreigners, if they don't work fully because they're part of the out-group, this becomes costly. But when you reach a certain stage, it's no longer possible to ignore that. And we argue that's going to be when you lose the majority. So in that sense, the majority matters. Right, so I guess that's actually all I want to say today. That is, we will see basically an inverted U-shape. There's going to be a force, namely combination, that's going to drive the whole thing upwards. But there's going to be in-group, out-group dynamics that will first let the output decrease. When that reaches a certain stage, that is, that the majority actually loses the majority, then creativity and innovation is released. So then you'll get a burst in organizational output after that point. So that's the basic idea of the paper. But I'll try to develop this a little bit more in detail. So, yeah, as I stated earlier, if we follow the Schumpeterian approach, then diversity is per se a good thing. It gives different backgrounds, perspectives, and so on, and can result in innovation. But social identity theory kind of suggests that this picture, this simple picture, is messed up a bit. Let me talk a little bit about how we actually measure this. So I've talked about cultural backgrounds, but actually we are going to be measuring this as nationality. That's been used in the literature, although one can of course always question that. And in our case, we're going to look at the Dutch. That's going to be our in-group. That's the majority of people, at least at the outset. And then the people from other parts of the country, of the world, are then the out-group. So that's what social identity theory really talks about. It is about the creation of group identities that involves categorization of an in-group as compared to an out-group, the other people, the people who are not like us. And then there's also the tendency to view one's own group somehow as superior to the others. So if it's in the Dutch or Danish setting, we know better about this environment and so on. We have more information. So it's good that you're here and so on, go and do your teaching. And in the paper, we are going to focus on the dominant Dutch culture and a number of non-Dutch people that are going to be in our sample. It's of course a little complicated who is Dutch and non-Dutch, but I'll also got to get into that. Reality is a little more complicated than the theoretical model. So in the innovation literature, we simply follow this literature and say that diversity can lead to more innovation. It potentially leads to the integration of these things. But it should also be noted that in our case here, we do not consider innovation in a very narrow sense. So it's not only about introducing a new smartphone or anything like this. This is of course going to be done by students, so in a limited time. So even if they have 1 year, which is considerable, then there's limits to how much they can produce in that time. So it turns out that actually where they are really trying to be innovative is in the way that they sell stuff and how they package it and things like this. So it has to be seen in a broader sense, such as including business models and things like this. So Nielsen and Winter has noted this in a very nice way. They say the creation of any sort of novelty in art, science, or practical life consists to a substantial extent of a recombination of conceptual and physical materials that were previously in existence. So it's about recombinations of knowledge components, if you like. I'm not sure this is from Mexico, probably it's from California. This is a fault line, and there's also a literature on fault lines. There are different fault lines, though, than the ones that we see in geography. Fault lines are these divisions between the in-group and the out-group, and they can be represented in differences in nationality and other things, and they result in social categorization. So one thing is that you're a Dane or a Dutchman or whatnot. The thing is, what is really essential here is that you become put in a box to be such a person that is Dutch, or if you're Italian, you are like this, and so on and so forth. So these fault lines here, if they are really true, we can of course see that it'll be difficult to cross from one side of the fault line to the other one, i.e. in this particular paper. It's going to be difficult to cross at the outset, being Dutch and being non-Dutch. There's going to be problems associated with that. So we developed these hypotheses here. We have us, that's the in-group, and then we have them over here, the ones that are not doing exactly like us, and therefore can perhaps be questioned. So the problem here is that when we get these in-group, out-group dynamics, it's difficult for team members to work together because it's legitimate for the in-group to say, well, we can just basically ignore these foreigners. Of course, they can play a minor role. They can go down and perhaps get the cakes at the bakery or something like this, but for the serious stuff that has to do with innovation, we sort of, by and large, ignore their inputs. And in terms of the subgroup dynamics, you can say that you have two good situations where there's not so much conflict. That is when you have pure one nationality at the left-hand side of the distribution. So in this case, only Dutch. You don't spend a lot of time arguing over things that comes from different backgrounds. And at the other end, you have, and there's actually one team that's almost perfectly diverse. So people are of many different nationalities within the team. That's also pretty good because then we cannot at least create categorization based on nationality, because we're all different. So it doesn't really create this subgroup formation. And there's also some literature that discusses how you can actually create a common identity after the subgroups have broken down, after the 50%, as we will have it, point in the distribution. So for the first part of my argument, it's just that a homogeneous team will have no problems with each other, but as we introduce more and more diversity in the team, then organizational output will fall because of this, let's say, the fact that you actually mute the voices of the people from the outgroup, and also that they don't really get to do as much work as one would like. So the cracking up of these teams into distinct subgroups, that will lead us to predict that for low to medium levels of cultural diversity within startup teams, there's a negative relation between such diversity and the business performance of the pertinent startups. But actually, given that we have a positive effect that's countervailing this, that has to do with increased recombination, our prediction is that this curve is not going to be that steep. I'll come back to that. The second hypothesis, that builds on culturally the observation that culturally diverse teams do not have the same opportunities to perform or to engage in subgroup dynamics. Early and Masakovsky in a paper in 2000 state that the team members will attempt to create and establish a new shared understanding of team member status, team processes, role expectation, communication methods, and so forth. That is when diversity has gone beyond a certain threshold. The question is, what is that? And here are again my two arguments. For firms of moderate size, it's going to be expensive to ignore the human capital inputs from a big group. And in as far as we are dealing with a relatively flat hierarchical structure, well then, and this is we argue is going to be realistic in startup teams, then of course you lose the simple majority in this particular case when you hit the 50% threshold. So the second hypothesis, when the share of a cultural majority within startup teams gets below the majority threshold, So you get below 50%, business performance of the pertinent startup will increase. So we should get this upward movement after the 50%. The final hypothesis is merely a consequence of the first two ones. We basically argued that very homogeneous teams and very diverse teams do not have in-group, out-group problems to an important extent. And at the same time, we argued that there is an increasing benefit of the diversity, just due to the simple recombination potential. So this would imply that if you look at the distribution, that actually where you have only the Dutch on that one side of the distribution, that should somehow be lower than the one where you are at the other side of the U, because over there you have you not only have the benefit of no subgroup formation, you also have benefit of diversity. So that should be somehow higher. So hypothesis 3, the negative slope of the relationship between cultural diversity within startup teams and performance up until the majority threshold for cultural majority will be less steep than the positive relationship between cultural diversity and performance emerging after the majority threshold. So we are going to measure this stuff about whether one side is higher than the other one by looking at the slopes of the curves that would lead from the majority threshold. So in simple terms, our idea looks like this. Actually, one of my most cited paper for sure is the 2006 strategic management paper with Eamon Salter, and I'm often sort of been confused with an inverted U. And so here I am with another inverted U, but this time it's asymmetric. So there's a little innovation or difference there. So the first hypothesis simply concerns this part here. We get increased diversity, but we also get subgroup formation as diversity increases. We get a worse performance when the Dutch, the Danes, the Mexicans, whoever they might be, the dominant group, when they get below the 50%, we will see that the potential for knowledge recombination and learning will increase. And then the final one is basically that this point over here should be located at a lower point than the point up here due to this recombination potential. And we're going to measure that by looking at those slopes and going to compare them. Okay, so here that was my theory. Not least, there's also an empirical part. It is a setup that is an international one. It is the Junior Achievement Young Enterprise Startup Program, and it's been undertaken in a number of countries in the US and in Europe and so on. And one good thing about this setup is that it's relatively long. Many of the studies that I referred to on my slides are from social psychology. How do they do research? Well, they do it in a laboratory setting. You get a task on the same day that you solve with your team members. There are some problems with this because that can reflect other things than deep differences in sort of social and cultural understanding. So although one can argue these are somehow not perfectly realistic startups, then 1 year is a long time. And this took place at the Amsterdam College of Applied Sciences. And the basis of this, it was based on 550 students. They were set up to manage real companies, and they had shareholders that then bought shares in the companies. They got family and friends and so on to invest in their little ventures. And students in this case frequently interacted, they built up relationships, they created routines and processes for achieving the common goal, that is to make euros at the end of the day. And they were asked also to submit balance sheets to the school. So some of the good features about this setup is that communication between team members is not hindered per se. So it's not because people came from different communities of practice like for instance the carpenter interacting with the engineer and that creating problems. These have a similar educational background, but not national background, but similar educational. So they can speak the same language. They're also about the same age. Social activities that includes problem solving, creativity, and so on. These are critical drivers of organizational performance. That's also true in this case. And the activity of the team is of serious significance to the work lives of the team members. So it's not only a matter of saying, okay, I don't like the looks of you or something like this, because you're going to see those persons again the next day and the week after and so on. So that is an advantage of this field experiment that we conducted, that it really went on for a long time and people got to know each other perhaps more than fairly well, actually. So students were defined as native or Dutch if both parents were born in the Netherlands, whereas students are considered immigrant, minority, or non-Dutch if at least one parent is not born in the Netherlands. That's been used before in the literature. It can also be justified. I think we can all recognize that who we are, to a large extent, come from our parents, and that's basically what we're saying here, that there is this transmission. So you don't need to be let's say, a first-generation immigrant to be considered immigrant in our study. Otherwise, we'll get too small numbers. Of course, we do a lot of things to check whether this is an issue. We measure the extent of cultural diversity in terms of the proportional representation of these nationalities. So it would be whether how big is the percentage of Dutch within this particular team. One disadvantage of this could be that there could also be subgroups within the team of the non-Dutch that could then form groups. So we could imagine there were groups of people from Suriname or people from Italy or things like that that would fall alternative groups. But one good thing about our experiment here is that there's so much diversity in it, at least if we count it broadly, that we can split it up, that we can split people across teams so that they are very rarely together with another person from the same nationality. So that's a good feature of the sample, that there's just great variation or diversity in the sample. The experiment, well, it was based on randomization, so God or somebody who decides here decided that nationalities had to be allocated into these teams according to certain proportions, but then given those certain proportions, randomization, the sample was randomized. So we know that there are very diverse teams in our sample. There are also some that are so purely Dutch. And that part is not random, but the rest is random. There's actually another feature of the sample is that they were also stratified according to gender. So, but that's not this paper. That's another paper. Gender also matters. So just to say that to this audience, I'm pleased to see many women around here. These teams, they work better if there's a mixture of both genders on the teams. But that's another paper that has been published by my co-author. So you can go, that's good evidence for that. And it's a good message to highlight. Any field is stronger with a mixture of genders and backgrounds. So we try to test this stuff with first and second generation. The results that show that the impact of cultural diversity that we detect, that's not driven by minority students in the first generation. Of course, the results get a little weaker because we throw out a lot of people from our sample. We also try to identify the effect of cultural diversity on team performance when we restrict our definition of non-Dutch from at least one parent to two parents. And that could actually matter a little bit. So that is a weakness of our study, we have to admit. But there's not enough power really to test it in the sample we have. We have to remember that I'm going to run some regressions here, and I'm used to running regressions on like thousands of firms. How many observations do we have in this paper? We have 45, so it's not a lot of variation. But the strength of the study is then that it has been randomized, right? So what we infer can be reasonably inferred to be causal. There could also be problems with composition dynamics. Some of the students, it also happens at CBS, some students drop out, so that could be a problem for us. So about 20%, as far as I recall, yes, 19% dropped out. So that reduced average team size from about 12 to about 10 at the end of the program. The good news here is that the composition of the teams, that's largely unaffected. So the correlation between teams' share of minorities at the baseline, and that's at the beginning, and at the end of the program, that's around 0.9. And dropout rates do not vary in relation to their cultural composition. So some regressions we ran, the regression coefficients of the share of non-Dutch at the baseline and its square, that when explaining dropout, that's insignificant. So we are quite convinced that this is not a major issue. There's also the issue of these teams had a management team, and these were then appointed by the rest of the team. So here we also impose something democratic into the team, actually. So then one could say, well, actually the leadership here, which we don't observe in our study, that is really what determines the outcome. But actually, our examination of this shows that if you regress the share of minorities in the management team on the share of minorities in the entire team, that returns a coefficient of 0.95 for the first half of the program and 0.97 for the second half. So this implies that basically your team will mirror its leadership. So it's true that the Dutch-dominated teams would tend to choose the Dutch. Those that were more diverse would tend to choose a non-Dutch. But so that's not per se explaining the results we get. So we are confident that the composition dynamics didn't really change the results. So I'm taking you through these sort of quite careful things because I think it's important to demonstrate that that we want, actually with this paper, we want to be very precise about this, because that's one of the core claims of the paper, that we can say something more precise about what drives what. But of course, as we all as researchers will realize, when we say that this one will drive that one, that's good. But then the next question becomes why. But I'll get to that also. But we are less good on that than the first conclusion. Okay, data. So there's data about teams and individuals. There's administrative data from the outset that came from the school. And then there were also 3 extensive surveys. So we have used these surveys for a number of things. So the students filled out the survey at the first day of the academic year, pre-treatment, halfway, and then at the end of the entrepreneurship program. That is what we call post-treatment. And there were very high response rates, so around 0.9 or something like that. Actually, the teams were assigned not according to their precise background, but according to the sound of their name. So this one can question, but we have also examined that, and it turns out that there is actually a very good match between the name and the actual nationality as we would want it. But that we could only know afterwards, because the teams had to be assigned on day 1 before we entered the program, before the students entered the program. Right, so here's some examples of what are these kind of things. So the one that actually, there's 45 of those. I could not have them all on one slide, so I just took 11 here. That's what could fit. So there's Firefly here. They are selling an ascending fire lantern for celebrations, and they made 2,226 euros in that 1 year. And they were also among the minority of student teams that actually made profits. The majority lost money on this, or their parents and friends did in the end of the day. There's other more simple things, bottles of wine, for instance, apple-shaped box to preserve apples. It's that sort of thing that these students engaged in. So if we look at some descriptive statistics, share minorities, So actually the share minority is a majority, so 50% of the students were non-Dutch given our definitions, 45% were Dutch. And the number of different, the number of people with different cultures or different nationalities within each team was about 6. So there's about 6 different nationalities within each team. But remember that some of the teams are purely Dutch. We can also see here where they come from, the Netherlands. So they're sort of fairly split. North America, only 1%. Central and South America, 15%. That's probably the Suriname effect, I take it, given that this is Dutch. Right, and we can also see down here what types of students they are, because they don't come from exactly the same programs. So we also try to examine whether that was an issue. Further descriptive statistics, just to say here the team level, mean at the outset 12 persons per team. So, some teams were up to 16. Here are the results, and these numbers are so small that you can probably not see them, but it doesn't matter too much. I'll explain them to you. So the first thing to observe is that for one set of variables that we have that has to do with sales, so just the sheer level of sales, there in general we do not find any results, no matter how we specify the model. But we do find stuff when it has to do with how different measures of profits, and it doesn't matter how you specify that more precisely. So one thing that we did first was to simply specify this is in a linear fashion. So we just say more diversity, the better. And as you can see here, there's no effect of that. So the simple Schumpeterian model, apologies for that, but that simple model is rejected in this round. The second one, that would involve just using the quadratic term, as I've done in several other papers before, to find U-shapes or inverted U-shapes. Here, we also do not find anything with that specification. So that doesn't seem to fit our data, this idea of the perfectly symmetric inverted U. However, when we try with the spline functions, then we have different specifications of that, and here you have to assume like a threshold. So in one that we like very much is around 55%, so 55% of the distribution. This implies that now only 45% of the team members are Dutch. So in this case here, we start to find a little bit of negative evidence for some ways of specifying profits, not too stable. So we can conclude that for the first part of the curve, it's either negative or it's insignificant, i.e. flat. But for the second part, we actually find, for all the profit numbers, we find positive and significant coefficients. So we really find strong evidence for this unleash of creative potential that I alluded to before. If we move further up, if we move further down in the distribution and set this to not 0.5, there's a little bit of evidence, but it's not so strong. So this would imply that the tipping point, if you like, occurs after 50%. So you really need to break down the majority of Dutch. It's not enough just to have a few non-Dutch on the team. You need to have a significant proportion of non-Dutch to make this work. And it also works for higher threshold levels like 0.6 and so on. So then the results just get stronger. So far so good. We think that we demonstrated that if you want to benefit from diverse teams, you have to take it all the way. So it's not enough just to have a small fraction, like hiring Folger, we did in 1998. That's not enough. He was a good guy, but it was not enough. You need to go much broader when you go international to hinder these subgroup dynamics. That's very fine, but a lot of the stuff I've said I've actually just claimed. I don't have any evidence for the story that's underlying this. But I'm going to speak a little bit to that because we have some evidence on that. So there are two predictions that you can make from this. That is that people with different cultural backgrounds, they bring diverse knowledge into the team. So that's one thing. And that people learn from each other in the team. Now, we can actually examine this by looking at the questionnaires that were pre-treatment and then post-treatment. So we can see, did something happen to people as they underwent this program? So we measure learning in terms of the development of 3 knowledge areas that are most relevant for successful entrepreneurship. That's business, entrepreneurship, and leadership. And for each of these areas, the indicator of individual learning is the difference between the self-assessed level in post-treatment and the pre-treatment questionnaire. So we found evidence that the culturally diverse teams that enter into the entrepreneurship program, they represent a more diverse pool of knowledge. So it's not only that they're diverse due to their nationality. I mean, that's what we can observe in that sense. But those differences in nationality, they also come with differences in knowledge about the different areas. So there's more diversity in knowledge that is related to the cultural diversity. On average, members of culturally diverse teams, they learn more. So if, again, self-assessed at the beginning of the program, self-assessed at the end, there's more learned for those that are culturally diverse. And then we did some additional regression analysis that we run separately on Dutch and non-Dutch students. That shows that the learning benefits of more cultural diversity, that benefits both groups. So actually, it's not only the Dutch that learns from the non-Dutch, it's also the other way around. So just the fact that you're different, you learn more, presumably, from the other people. One alternative explanation that one could come up with, rather than the learning story, rather than the recombination story, would be that culturally diverse teams benefit from targeting more diverse and larger markets. So if you have people who are Italian in the team, maybe they could cater for the Italian sub-market in the Netherlands. Or if you have another nationality, they could cater for their sub-market. And then if you have a lot of nationalities, you can cater for many sub-markets. So that could be an alternative explanation. So we tried to categorize our firms in high/low technology, whether it was product service, and the type of market orientation it had. But we could not see any sort of systematic pattern between cultural diversity and the type of venture started. So it was not, so in as far as this product differentiation reflect itself in the type of product that you target, then we did not find any relationship there. So we don't think that that's the explanation. The other side of the story, so the first, you could say the positive side of my story is that there's a possibility for recombining, for learning and so on. That we think that mechanism, we have indication that that could be it. The other part has to do with the conflict. And there, students were asked about conflicts, not related specifically to the tasks that they were actually performing, but whether they had conflicts within the team, conflict or disagreement, and they had to rate that on a 5-point scale. And this kind of conflict that simply occurred more often in culturally diverse teams. So, but we do not have data to split this into a very precise part of the distribution. So our results show that culturally homogeneous and moderately heterogeneous teams tend to experience less relationship-oriented conflicts than diverse teams. That was our assumption from the beginning, and that seems to be confirmed. It should also be noted that whether these conflicts that emerge because we are different, whether they lead to constructive outcomes, that we cannot say much about. But it should come out through the organizational performance. Right. So my story was this one. First part of the distribution, we expected a either flat or negative relationship between cultural diversity in teams and subsequent performance. After that threshold, we expected that in-group, out-group dynamics would break down and therefore unleash the creative potential. A corollary of this was that we should expect that actually over here we have the advantage of no disagreements, but we have the disadvantage of no diversity in terms of knowledge. Whereas over here, if we have disagreements, they're more constructive, and we have the advantage of diversity. So therefore, we should expect a steeper slope here and on the other side. And except this one over here that often turns out to be flat, then actually we got more or less this story confirmed. Okay, so implications. I already alluded to the implications of this. I think it's important for us who work in academic departments, but also in many other team situations, that you don't solve the problem of diversity just by hiring a few extra people, and also considering the negative aspects of just being a few. One thing I didn't tell you about the story here is that when we hired Volker, what language did we use in the department subsequent to hiring Volker, who was German and English speaking? We spoke Danish. I mean, there was only one guy. So it was only after a certain point when we said, okay, now there are so many international people here that now on the Wednesday meeting at the department, the language is English. Before the head of department said, well, the language is Danish unless it particularly pertains to Volker. But that in the 2000s that changed. So I think that we have to think about this, that if you want to go diverse, you have to go seriously. We believe that we make a contribution to social identity theory also. There has been a lot of theorizing about which direction this could go. And it's also not been clear when subgroup dynamics sets in and when it stops. We think that we have helped in clarifying this by combining the Schumpeterian insights with the social identity theory. And our sort of baseline that I've come to many times is also in the title. It is the majority matters. It matters whether you're the majority, whether you're the majority of Dutch, or whether you're the majority of a diverse set of people. We think we also contribute to the innovation literature. That's where I come from, innovation management, economics of innovation, that sort of thing. Because often in this literature, actually, there's been a very Schumpeterian focus on the benefits of recombination and so on, without considering, in very explicit terms at least, what are the potential downsides of bringing together very different people. So we believe that we have helped in specifying some of these disadvantages of diversity. And we think that also there are some strength in our experiments. In a lot of the literature that's been conducted at the firm level, predominantly in the innovation literature, of course the inferences here have the usual limitations, but here, given the fact that we had a randomized controlled experiment, still in a realistic setting, that allows us to make causal inferences, at least in the first round, saying that diversity is linked to organizational outcome. Then the mechanisms is still open. I admit that's still a little bit open for debate. So that concludes my presentation here, so thank you very much.
Si quieren hacer la pregunta en español, la puedo traducir, o si la quieren decir directamente en inglés, adelante. Y creo que sería interesante, it would be good if you just call your name, su nombre y de qué organización vienen.
Okay.
Allá atrás, gracias.
I'm going to make it in English. José Miguel Benavente from the IDB. I have like 3 questions related more on the robustness of the work. I'm here.
Okay.
There we are.
Thank you.
The first one is related with the time that the group expend to solve their differences. Mainly because implicit on the transaction cost in your model is the time issue. So do you have any idea, using your surveys, that probably one of the costs or have a lot of cultural issue is at the start? Probably you're going to spending a lot of time to solve your, all the problems, and then you ended up, the group was very, more fluid, and then all these problems will pass. So probably another dimension in your graph will be time spending, trying to solve the problems. The second one is, you have any idea about the specialities of the people inside the group? For example, I can imagine that those groups who have an Egyptian on the selling side will work very good if you have the German in charge of the costs on that group, and probably the opposite will be different. So do you have any idea about the specialities of the role that the group have played, members of the group have played, and probably there's certain correlation between nationalities and the kind of activities may explain the performance of the group? And my third question is related with those who finance these groups. Because you said that there were family and friends, so my question is really, do you have any idea about the amount of money that they got from different groups? Because it could explain the performance because they have more money coming from different sources. Secondly, there's any idea about the diversity of the financing group? Because it would be very interesting to see that the only Dutch are financing only Dutch, or the Dutch are financing more. If they know about the diversities and beforehand, if they know that diversity is an issue, to whom they financed and how much they financed. The 3 issues could be just to check, the robustness of your results.
Would you like to have first round of questions, or do you want to address?
I can take this. So there are 3 questions. So that's probably that probably correspond to what I can possibly manage due to my sort of ability. And these are 3 excellent questions. So time spent, that is something that we would. It's not in the questionnaire. So this idea of whether we sort of see it like there's a cost to be paid at the beginning and so on, and then at a later stage there will be less conflict. One thing that speaks a little bit to this issue is the observation that actually at the end of the study, actually still the groups that were very diverse, the students in those settings, they reported that they had more fights and so on than teams that were less diverse. So this would sort of indicate I cannot know whether this has decreased over time, but it's still higher than the other ones at the end of the period. But we don't have, these questionnaires do not specify, well, I mean, there is a middle one, so we could actually look at whether there was an increase or decrease, but it remains high at the end. It's a good point. We will, I take note of that. And then the question of the members of the team, that's what we try. We don't have data on that, but it's an important issue. So we tried to look at what kind of specialities that the people would self-identify with, like do they have knowledge of leadership, do they have knowledge of entrepreneurship, and so on. So that's what we use in some of our robustness checks, or let's say indicative evidence of the mechanisms. So that there is this idea that actually there is a correlation, at least, between being different and having a different speciality. So we can take it that far. Of course, there's another element to your question. That is, of course, that there's also the issue of cultural distance. Whether if a Dutch hires a German or you hire an Egyptian, then of course potentially you might get more out of hiring the Egyptian because he or she is more different. But that we've kind of assumed that away in this particular study. We also don't have power enough to really deal with it. And then the financing. So that's an important question, but we have kept that out because the amount of money that can be financed is fixed for each team. So it's not that it's not because some are not performing better because they are better financed.
Thank you very much. ¿Qué había otra pregunta aquí adelante?
Marcos Brajan from the University of São Paulo, Brazil, at the Management Department. Very interesting your results, and congratulations for the paper, and the presentation here was very clear and very important in terms of the practice for managers and other peoples. I have a supervisor that PhD dissertation recently with focus on cultural diversity and project management. Okay, the focus was project, not teams in a startup groups, as you focus on this issue. I have just one observation, so that you can. I would like to listen from you. Is with respect to the classification of the diversity. You use the measure of being part or not being part of the country. I think it's a weak measure for me, because I have studied a little bit the Hofstede theory and his book on internationalization and diversity among the nationals. And I have used it, the several criteria they propose to measure diversity, which includes a lot of factors that you have not shown for us. And I think it was more a stronger measure that compared with the measures you have used. Do you think there is importance of that? Do you think it is important or not for your research?
Right, I think that's an important point, and I think any research is always an opportunity to go deeper. So like in Hofstede's work, there are all these characteristics of nationalities. So whether culture is more feminine, and there's a lot of labels that according to which one could sort of characterize a culture or a nation, if you want. And so we have not done that. I mean, so also because the aim was to say something causal about whether diversity leads to whether that leads to better performance, and if so, how. That is would be difficult for us to operationalize in a way that we can be perfectly sure to observe. But of course, maybe
concept using countries like Brazil, Argentina, Chile. The concept in terms of really measure the differences are so weak if you use the concept you have shown us. So this is the main thing I have. I think I have to point out. I don't know how is the differentiation in Europe in each country compared with South America or Latin America on the countries. So thank you very much.
Gracias. ¿Alguien más? ¿Alguna pregunta? I do have a question. Were you able to characterize the conflict within the teams?
So what we have data on is simply whether there were disagreement that were not related to the particular tasks that they were performing. So that we have information on. But actually, these were not the core design of the study was made to identify the relationship between national cultural composition and then the performance outcome. And then there were these questionnaires were administered to get some of ideas of what they were doing, but it's not that detailed, so that we cannot say with a great certainty that it was that kind of conflict. But we can say that there were more conflicts not related to tasks in the more diverse teams. That's what we can say based on that.
Interesting. ¿Una pregunta más? Tenemos tiempo. Of course.
Well, I'm really focused on the methodology, not the results itself. Another point you have mentioned in your final comments was the relation as you adopt as casual, not just an association. What the arguments that you have behind to support this kind of proposition, which I mean is very hard to adopt in the social sciences?
Right. Yeah. So the idea of this is that that the experiment has been randomly assigned. So there is a the composition of the teams have been decided by us, and then apart from that, team members have been randomized into the various groups. So there's no heterogeneity in the way in which these teams are selected. That is purely done by us, the researchers. So that's what allows us to say that this is more than an association.
Well, I would be a little bit concerned about this kind of conclusion because it's very difficult to isolate it. A hundred of factors, external factors that are presented in the relationship. And as we are commonly not able to control all the factors, all the variables, I think this conclusion must be viewed with some restrictions. But anyway, I like very much of the study and congratulations.
Tenemos otra pregunta de este lado y después acá viene otra. Hasta adelante, tercera fila. Gracias. Si levanta la mano la persona que iba a preguntar, por favor, atrás a tu derecha. Gracias.
Hello, my name is Joost Hayes, I'm Dutch.
Oh yeah.
I have some comments or questions that don't affect the results because I think it's somehow included. It's more when you started your presentation in the theoretical framework, you were talking always about, well, they have the majority and they can marginalize the other persons. You started as it was if they are fighting already from the beginning. And I think that was for me a little bit, because also the Dutch, well, or each country, the majority are also our majority in nationality, but they are very different. And it's true if there are a few foreigners in a group, then they are very exotic and it's nice to speak to them. But if the majority are foreigners, then things could change in that way. But it's more in comment. It's not really a question, but maybe you can tell something about it. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure that. So I'm not sure that we necessarily assume that the fighting is going on already from the beginning. It may take many forms and shapes. All I'm saying, and this is also from my own experience, is that there is, if there is a dominant group, there is a natural tendency. There is a tendency that the dominant group will then take the serious decision. So that is all I'm saying. I'm not necessarily saying that they are. So when you are only when there's only let's say that they're all Dutch except one, then probably the number of arguments it will be relatively small. But as you move out through the distribution, you get more and more foreigners, and there probably you can get more fights, but you cannot be the majority doesn't decide anymore. So I think that's a critical point. It is who takes the decision on what to do at a given point in time. But there's probably going to be some fighting with it. That's also what our results show with the pre and post tests.
Tenemos una pregunta más aquí adelante.
Bronwyn Hall, UC Berkeley. So, yeah, it's a beautifully clear presentation. I do wish I could have seen the numbers, but that's because I like numbers. But I would also like to see a graph. Your hypothesis graph is really nice, and I'd like to see a graph with the preferred profit figure. I think that would be quite interesting, because I think it would show the dispersion that you have in the outcomes, and also it would show the fact that it's weaker on the left-hand side of the graph than on the right-hand side. So, but my main comment is, if I've understood correctly, your key variable is the share of Dutch on the team, which means this is about the majority, the question of the majority dominance, and not about diversity. You can have very diverse teams. You could have the same majority, 45% Dutch on the team or whatever, and the rest of it could be diverse, or it could be non-diverse. They could be all Danes or all Americans. Yes. And so so it's really a question of emphasis. It doesn't change the results. It's a question of emphasis. Of the use of the term cultural diversity throughout kind of makes you think that's what it's about, but it's really not quite about that. And so I wondered if you ever gave consideration to using this sort of the usual measure of diversity, namely the Herfindahl, instead of the majority, just to see if you got any different results from that. Now, with 45 observations, you may not, but it could be interesting. Obviously, I would really like it if you were able to do something along the lines of figuring out how far away they were culturally, but that's much more complex.
Thank you. These are excellent comments as well. So yes, I mean, so in the paper that does exist, we do have some. We don't have graphs, but we do have we do have some size effects and things like that in there that should be there. So these sizes are also they're sizable, especially on the right hand side. But the second point, which I think is this is something that we've been considering a lot, because you're absolutely right. So we are not so much considering diversity in that sense, because it's really the Dutch against the non-Dutch, and how much diversity is that? That's so in the experimental design, and due to the diversity of the sample, there is a lot of diversity in the diverse group, if you like. So we do not observe in this group that there will be in one of the groups that there would be a huge group of people from Suriname or something like that. So the diverse part is really diverse vis-a-vis the Dutch. But then, of course, one can question the diversity terminology. I would have to agree with that. And then, of course, then the Herfindahl comment, which I agree with, would be a slightly different thing that would be less relevant because of the way the data has been constructed. Thank you for that. We might want to use another term than diversity, or maybe qualified.
Well, thank you very much. Gracias a todos. And just to give you an acknowledgement on behalf of the